You must understand, child, that cruelty is rarely a thunderclap. It is more often the quiet closing of a door, the turning of a shoulder, or a single perfectly aimed word delivered across a polished dining table. It does not always shout. Sometimes it merely smiles. And on that Tuesday in late autumn, the cruelty smiled. The word, when it came, was as delicate and as cold as the frost filming the window panes of Blackmore Manor. Margaret Ainsworth felt it land not in her ears, but in the pit of her stomach, a small hard stone of ice, a know your place. The Dowager Duchess of Blackmore, her employer, said it without raising her voice. Her tone was conversational, almost pleasant, as if she were commenting on the quality of the venison, but her eyes, the color of faded slate, held a glint of triumph. Across the table, her son, Alexander the current duke, froze with a wineglass halfway to his lips. The silence that fell upon the room was absolute, broken only by the nervous crackle of the fire in the great stone hearth. It was a silence that had weight and texture. It pressed down on Margrea's shoulders, pushed at the back of her neck. She could feel the gaze of the footman carefully blank. She could feel the held breath of the duke. Most of all, she felt the dowager's satisfaction, a palpable warmth radiating from the head of the table. The crime had been this. The duke had been speaking, his voice low and tight with frustration, about the yields from the North Pasture tenants. "And it makes no sense," he had said, staring into the candle flame as if the answer might be written there. The rents are paid, yet the accounts show a loss for the third quarter running. Davies insists it is merely a matter of seasonal fluctuation. But, he had trailed off a muscle, working in his jaw, and Margaret, forgetting herself for a single fatal moment, had spoken. She had been the dowager's companion for 2 years, a ghost in grey bombazine. Her role to read aloud, fetch shawls, and endure meandering, self-pitying monologues. She was meant to be furniture that could walk. But her mind, the part of her they could not see or own, was a thing of sharp, clean lines and elegant calculations. It was a mind built for ledgers. A legacy from the father she was not supposed to mention. "It might not be the rents, your grace," she had murmured, her eyes on her own untouched plate. "If the loss is consistent across quarters despite fluctuating yields." A single miscategorized capital expense, carried over and amortized incorrectly, could create a phantom deficit that would appear precisely that way. The silence that followed her words was one of stunned appraisal from the duke, whose head had lifted, his dark, tired eyes suddenly focused on her with an unnerving intensity. And it was that focus, that brief, shocking flicker of a man, seeing her as something other than his mother as shadow, that had summoned the dowager's quiet thunder. "Know your place," the place of a paid companion, the place of a woman with no family, no fortune, and a past best left buried. The place of a creature who was in the cold calculus of this house, an expense and nothing more. Margaret lifted her gaze from her plate, not to the duke, but to the dowager. She did not flush. She did not stammer an apology. Her face, a pale oval in the candlelight, remained composed, watchful. A lifetime of being overlooked had taught her the art of stillness. She had learned to pack all her feelings down into a small, tight space in her chest where no one could see them. She inclined her head just slightly. A gesture of acknowledgement, not apology. "Forgive me, your grace," she said, her voice even and low. It was the voice she used to read poetry, devoid of any discernible emotion. Then she placed her napkin beside her plate, the linen a stark white against the dark wood. She pushed her chair back, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet room. She stood. Every movement was precise, economical. She was not fleeing. She was executing a maneuver. She turned to the dowager and performed a small, perfect curtsy, the one she had been taught for presentation at court, a lifetime ago before her world had collapsed. The dip was graceful, her back straight. It was a curtsy of dismissal. "Eh, if you will excuse me." "Ah," she said to the room at large. And then she turned and walked away. She did not hurry. Her footsteps made almost no sound on the thick Aubusson carpet. She felt Alexandra's eyes on her back, a physical pressure. She did not look back. She walked through the door the footman held open for her and into the cold, echoing hall, leaving the three of them of the Duke, his mother, and the ghost of his late wife, that always seemed to occupy the fourth chateau, their suffocating silence. In her small room in the east wing, she did not weep. Weeping was a luxury, like new ribbons or warm gloves. Instead, she opened her single traveling trunk. The hinges creaked, a complaint. It was time to go. There was no coming back from a humiliation like that. She had overstepped. She had been seen. And in this house, for a woman like her, being seen was the most dangerous thing of all. She had known the rules. She had simply for a moment forgotten her place. The fire in the dining room seemed to shrink in on itself, consuming the oxygen in the room. Alexander set his wine glass down. The small click of crystal on wood was like a gunshot. He looked at his mother. The pleasant, placid mask was back in place, but he saw the brittle satisfaction beneath it. He had been seeing it his whole life. That was unnecessary," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had a core of iron she had not heard in years. Not since Amelia's death. The dowager waved a dismissive hand, a flash of rings in the candlelight. The girl was impertinent. She needed reminding of her position. It is for her own good, and yours. A man in your position cannot be seen taking financial advice from a paid companion. What would people say? I could not give a damn what people would say, Alexander said. The words clipped. What I care about is the fact that this estate is bleeding money. My tenants are suffering. And the only person to offer a coherent thought on the matter in 6 months has just been dismissed from my table like a scullery maid. He noticed things. It was his blessing and his curse. While his father had been alive, a booming, careless man who saw only what he wanted to see, Alexander had been the quiet observer. He noticed the way a tenant farmer's hands shook with cold. He noticed the slight tremor in his late wife's smile when she was tired, and for 2 years, he had noticed Miss Ainsworth. He had noticed her quiet efficiency, the way she managed his mother's tyrannical moods, with a calm that bordered on supernatural. He had noticed her hands, not idle in her lap, but often mending a maid's torn apron, or restitching a loose binding on a book. He had noticed the way she listened, her head tilted, her gaze distant, as if she were hearing not just the words, but the mathematics behind them. And tonight, he had noticed the startling clarity of her mind, a beacon of pure logic in the fog of his own grief and confusion. He rose from the table. I believe you have had enough of my company for one evening, Mother Alexander, do not be dramatic. But he was already walking toward the door, his long-legged stride eating up the carpet. He did not look back. He had spent 2 years entombed in this house, frozen in the past, honoring his grief, by letting everything his father had built crumble around him. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both. Badly tonight something had cracked. The ice was breaking. He found her not in tears, as another woman might have been, but with her trunk open on her bed, her few possessions being folded with a stark, methodical precision. The room was cold, the fire in her small grate, little more than a handful of glowing embers. She looked up as he entered, her hands stilling on a stack of linen. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a quiet resignation. Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly neutral. She did not curtsy. You are leaving," he stated. It was not a question. Seems the most sensible course of action," she replied, her gaze dropping back to the trunk. My position has become untenable, because of what my mother said, because I forgot myself," she corrected him softly. Your mother was merely issuing a reminder." He walked further into the room, his presence seeming to shrink the already small space. He stopped before the trunk, looking down at the neatly folded gray and brown dresses, the small stack of books. It was the sparse luggage of a woman who expected to have to move on at a moment's notice. What you said at dinner," he began, his voice low, about the accounts, the amortized expenses. "Explain it." She looked up at him then, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something behind the calm facade. Annoyance. "Ah, Your Grace, I am packing." "I hardly think this is the time for a lesson in accounting." "I do," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I need a wife by the end of the year, Miss Ainsworth. That is what my trustees, my solicitor, and my mother tell me. A respectable, well-bred woman to give me an heir and put this house back in order. But that is not, I find, what I actually need." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on her. The candlelight from the hall threw his face into sharp relief, all harsh planes and shadows. He looked tired, haunted, but more alive than she had ever seen him. "I do not need a duchess," he said, the words coming out flat and hard. "I need an accountant. I need someone who can find where the money is going. I need you to look at the books." Margaret stared at him. Of all the things she had expected, a stiff apology, a formal dismissal with a month's wages, perhaps even a lecture of his own, it had not been this. It was a proposition more shocking, more intimate, than any other he could have made. He was not asking for her hand. He was asking for her mind. And secret, of course. He added, as if that were a minor detail. My mother must not know. No one must know. But I saw your face tonight. You know something. You see something I don't. I am asking you to show me a." She thought of her father. She thought of the shame, the whispers, the ruin that had followed his name. His skill, the one thing he had passed on to her, had been branded a disgrace. She had hidden it, buried it, treated it like a secret sickness. And now, this man, this duke, was asking her to unearth it. Not for his amusement, but for his salvation. For a long moment, she said nothing. The only sound was the sigh of the wind against the window. He was offering her a chance. Not just to stay, but to be something other than a shadow. But it was a dangerous chance, a path that led directly into the heart of the very secrets this house was determined to keep. She looked from his intense, waiting face to her half-packed trunk. She could leave. She could find another post, another gray life in another cold house, and be safe. Or she could stay and risk everything for the chance to use the one part of herself she had been taught to despise. Men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all, but grief can sometimes sharpen a man's sight, make him see the one tool that can save him, even if it looks nothing like what he thought he was looking for. Alexander did not yet see a woman. He saw a solution. But in that cold little room, for the first time in a long time, he was seeing clearly. And that, as it turned out, was enough to begin. Margaret slowly closed the lid of her trunk. The sound echoed the finality of a door shutting on one life, and the faint, uncertain creak of another opening. "I will not be a spy in your mother's house, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "If I do this," she continued, lifting her chin, "I will not be in secret, not from the staff, not from the household. I will not scurry through back passages and study ledgers by candlelight in my bedroom. That is the behavior of a thief, and I am not a thief." She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She was setting terms with a duke. The sheer audacity of it was a heady, terrifying thing. "A will require a proper office. Your late father's study would be suitable. It has the best light. I will require unimpeded access to all estate documents, correspondence, and account books, stretching back at least 10 years. And I will require your authority to question any member of the staff, including your solicitor, Mr. Davies A." Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly. He had expected gratitude, perhaps some hesitant negotiation. He had not expected a list of demands delivered with the crisp authority of a field marshal. Furthermore," she added, her voice dropping another notch, becoming even more resolute, I will require a salary. A proper one, recorded in the household accounts. I am not a member of your family, to be given pin money out of charity. If I am to do this work, I will be an employee, with a formal title. Estate analyst, perhaps. She met his gaze directly. I will not be a whisper. I will be a line item in your ledger. Is that understood? A long silence stretched between them. He studied her, truly studied her, as if seeing a completely new person, standing in the shell of the old one. He saw not a timid companion, but a woman of formidable will and startling self-possession. He saw the spine of steel that had allowed her to walk out of that dining room without a tremor. He had offered her a clandestine, slightly shameful arrangement, and she had countered by demanding a legitimate, public position of authority. A slow smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile, and it transformed his face, erasing some of the deep-seated weariness in his eyes. At estate analyst, he repeated, tasting the words. I see. He gave a short, sharp nod. Very well, Miss Ainsworth. Your terms are acceptable. He paused. The study has been locked since my father's death. I will have it open for you in the morning. Consider it your office. Something in him had shifted. It was the precise moment his quest for a solution became an interest in a person. He had come looking for a key to unlock a puzzle, and had found the locksmith instead. And she was more fascinating than any puzzle. Margaret felt a tremor go through her, a shock of victory and fear. She had done it. She had spoken her worth into existence, and he had not laughed. He had agreed. Thank you, you're great. The thanks, I suspect, will be mine to give, he said. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. My mother will be displeased. Your mother's displeasure is a matter for you, your grace, Margaret said quietly. My concern is the numbers. They, at least, do not have moods. He looked at her for a moment longer, a strange expression on his face, something akin to grudging admiration. Then he was gone, his footsteps receding, down the long, cold corridor. Margaret stood alone in the center of the room, her heart beating a frantic, triumphant rhythm against her ribs. She looked at her closed trunk. She had made her choice. She had refused to know her place. Instead, she had just created a new one entirely. The next morning, the household at Blackmore awoke to a quiet revolution. The news traveled through the servants' hall on whispers, from the butler to the housemaids to the stable hands. The Duke himself had been seen unlocking the doors to the old Duca's study, a room that had been a dusty shrine for 5 years. And Miss Ainsworth, the dowager's mousy companion, had walked into it not as a visitor, but as its new occupant. The Dowager Duchessa's reaction was precisely as volcanic as Alexander had predicted. Her fury was a cold, contained thing, more terrifying than any shouting. She confronted him in the breakfast room, her voice a low hiss. Oh, what is the meaning of this, Alexander? The staff is gossiping. You have installed that woman in your father's office. It is a desecration. It is a practical necessity, mother, he replied, not looking up from his newspaper. And Miss Ainsworth has a unique talent for figures. I have engaged her to audit the estate accounts. You have engaged her. She is a companion. Her father was a disgraced clerk who died in debt. A lie that originally ruined her, now resurfacing. The old poison, administered again. Her father's history is of no consequence to me, Alexander said, his voice dangerously level. Her skills, however, are. The estate is in peril. Or, has that escaped your notice? You are making a fool of yourself, she spat. And of this family. You are giving a nobody power and authority. She will abuse it. Women of her sort always do. That will be all. Mother, he said, the words a clear dismissal. He finally lowered the paper and met her gaze. His eyes were cold. She has an office, a title, and my full authority. You will not interfere. Is that understood? The dowager stared at him, her face a mask of outrage. For the first time in his adult life, he was not yielding to her. He was drawing a line in the sand, and he was placing Margaret Ainsworth firmly on his side of it. Defeated for the moment, she swept from the room, leaving the scent of lavender and fury in her wake. Margareta's new world was a universe of dust and paper. The old Duca's study was a handsome, wood-paneled room, but it was suffocating under a shroud of neglect. A fine layer of gray dust coated every surface. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dried ink, decaying leather, and forgotten things. It was a room that had been holding its breath for 5 years. Her first act was not to open a ledger, but to throw open the heavy velvet curtains. Watery, morning light spilled into the room, illuminating swirling motes of dust. She opened the tall windows, letting the sharp, cold air of the north rush in, a clean shock to the system. The house seemed to exhale. Then she began. The ledgers were stacked in towering, precarious piles. They were a monument to chaos. Some were meticulously kept, others marred by sloppy entries, blotches of ink, and cryptic notes in the margins. It was the financial history of a house in slow-motion collapse. Grief, she saw, had been a poor steward. Since the death of the late Duchess, Amelia, and Alexandera's subsequent withdrawal from the world, the careful order of the estate had frayed and unraveled. She worked with a silent, ferocious concentration. She was not just a woman in a room. She was a mind diving into a sea of numbers, seeking the hidden currents, the anomalies, the shape of the thing that was pulling the estate under. She filled pages of her own notebook with figures, her handwriting small, neat, and ruthlessly clear. The central image of her world became the columns of black ink on cream paper, a language she understood better than any other. She did not win over the household with charm. She had none to spare. She won them, slowly, with confidence. When the cook, Mrs. Gable, complained that the butcher's bills were higher than the meat delivered, Margaret did not argue. She spent an afternoon with the kitchen accounts, and the next morning presented the cook with a simple cross-referenced sheet that proved Mrs. Gable was right. An overcharging scheme was uncovered and corrected. Mrs. Bitchay. Gable looked at her with newfound respect. When a young housemaid was accused of stealing a silver locket, and the dowager was calling for her instant dismissal, Margaret quietly intervened. She spent an hour retracing the girlish steps, and found the locket fallen behind a chest of drawers. She returned it to the dowager without comment, and the maid kept her position, her gratitude a silent, fervent look whenever Margaret passed. She was not kind in a soft, demonstrative way. Her kindness was practical. It was the kindness of setting things right. It was the kindness of seeing a problem and solving it. Quietly and without fanfare, Alexander watched her from a distance. He found himself making excuses to pass the study, to see the light from her lamp, burning steadily, long after the rest of the house was dark and silent. Sometimes he would enter, using the pretext of bringing her a cup of tea or a plate of sandwiches from the kitchen. They would talk, at first only of the accounts. She would show him a discrepancy, a flow of funds that made no logical sense. Her fingers would trace the lines of ink, and he found himself mesmerized by the quiet competence of her hands. "Here," she said one evening, her voice low with concentration, "are the funds allocated for the roof repairs on the tenant farms. The disbursement was approved, signed by your father, 3 years ago. The money was paid out. But according to the stewardess reports from that same year, the repairs were never made. A. Davies handled that," he said, frowning, "our solicitor. He oversaw the contracts. Then Mr. Davies has some questions to answer," she said simply, "because £5,000 vanished between the treasury and the tenants." Slowly, their conversations began to drift. He would linger, leaning against a bookshelf, and ask about her day. She, in turn, would ask a careful question about a name in a ledger, and it would lead him to tell a story about a tenant, a horse, a memory of his father. The study, once a cold mausoleum, was becoming the warmest room in the house. A fire was always lit in the grate. The scent of dust had been replaced by the smell of books, beeswax, and the faint, clean scent of the soap Margaret used. It was becoming the heart of the house, the one place where honest work was being done. One night, a fierce November gale threw itself against the manor, rattling the windows and moaning in the chimneys. The power of the storm seemed to find its way inside, making the great house feel vulnerable and isolated. Margaret was working late, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, when Alexander appeared in the doorway. He was not carrying tea. He simply stood there watching her. "Ah, you should not work so late." "Ah," he said. The numbers do not keep hours, Your Grace," she replied, not looking up. He walked to the fireplace and stood before it, staring into the flames. My wife, Amelia, she hated storms," he said, his voice quiet. She would have all the curtains drawn, every candle lit. She would play the pianoforte, hymns mostly, to drown out the sound of the wind. Margaria's pen stilled. He had never spoken of his wife to her before. Her name was a sacred unspoken word in this house. She was the light in this place, he continued, his back to her. When she died, the light went out. I think I have been sitting in the dark ever since." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were raw with a grief that was still fresh, still sharp. "You have opened the curtains, Miss Ainsworth." It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a kind of wondering surprise. She had let the light back in, and he was only just now realizing he could see again. The dead should be honored, not buried under dust. Margaret said softly. A memory needs air to breathe, Your Grace, or it suffocates the living." She was thinking of her father, of the way his memory had been erased, his name a synonym for shame. She had spent years suffocating. Alexander looked at her, and in that moment, the distance between Duke and estate analyst dissolved, leaving only a man and a woman in a firelit room, circled by a storm. He saw the faint shadow of her own past sorrows in her eyes, the echo of a loss that mirrored his own. Men do not always care to be seen, but when they are truly lonely, being seen for who they are is a kind of rescue. He crossed the room and stood behind her chair. She could feel the warmth from his body, could hear the soft sound of his breathing. She kept her eyes fixed on the ledger before her, the numbers suddenly blurring. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pull the shawl higher on her shoulders. It was a small, simple gesture, an act of care so unexpected it made her breath catch in her throat. You are cold," he said. "I am fine, Your Grace." Alexander," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. My name is Alexander." She did not respond. She could not. The sound of his name, spoken in that quiet, intimate way, was more potent than any storm. It was the beginning of a thaw, a deep, slow melting of the ice that had encased both their hearts. And as the wind howled outside, a fragile, dangerous warmth began to grow between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the grate. By December, the rhythm of their evenings had become a settled thing. After a perfunctory dinner with his silent, simmering mother, Alexander would retreat to the study, where Margaret would have her findings for the day laid out. The initial mystery of the missing funds had deepened into a complex web of deceit. It was not mere incompetence that was crippling Blackmore. It was a deliberate, systematic campaign of fraud, orchestrated with patience and skill. And at the center of that web, Margaret was increasingly certain, sat Mr. Davies, the family solicitor, a man who had served the estate for 30 years. "Ahas, clever," she said one evening, pushing a summary sheet across the desk towards Alexander. He never takes large sums. It is always small amounts, disguised as legitimate expenses, a bill for phantom repairs here, an inflated fee for legal services there, has been bleeding this estate dry, 1,000 tiny cuts, for years. He started during your father's last illness. Alexander stared at the sheet, his face grim. Davies? He taught me how to ride. He was at my wedding. He stood by my father's graveside. The sense of betrayal was a cold weight in his voice. Men you trust are the only ones who can truly betray you," Margaret said quietly. It was an earned aphorism, drawn from the bitter well of her own experience. "Al, how do we prove it?" he asked, looking up at her. "His word against a yours." The unspoken implication hung in the air. The word of a respected solicitor against that of a disgraced clerk's daughter. We need the one thing he thinks no one will ever find." She said. "A hidden ledger, a private account book. Men like Davies, they are arrogant. They like to admire their work. He will have recorded it somewhere." Their search began. It bound them together. A shared secret, a common purpose. They became partners, conspirators in the quiet of the night. The professional distance between them eroded with every shared confidence, every late-night conversation. He learned about her father, not the caricature of the disgraced felon, but the brilliant, gentle man who had taught her that numbers were a form of poetry. She, in turn, began to see, beyond the grieving, withdrawn Duke to the man beneath, intelligent, deeply honorable, and far lonelier than anyone knew. He noticed the way she bit her lip when she was close to a breakthrough, the faint smudge of ink that was often on her right cheek, the way she would push a stray strand of hair back from her face with an impatient gesture. He found himself cataloging these small details, hoarding them like treasures. His attention, once a broad, unfocused thing, had narrowed to a single point: her. The thaw was not just between them. The house itself seemed to be breathing again. Fires burned in grates that had been cold for years. The scent of baking bread, once more, filled the halls. The staff, loyal to the Duke and now fiercely protective of Miss Ainsworth, went about their duties with a renewed sense of purpose. Blackmore was coming back to life, and the Dowager watched it all with the cold fury of a monarch witnessing a coup. She saw the light in the study, heard the low murmur of their voices. She saw the way her son looked at Margaret, with an interest he had not shown in any woman since Amelia. She saw her own influence, her control over her grieving son, slipping away, and she would not allow it. The breakthrough came on a frigid night, just before Christmas, tucked away in a dusty crate in the wine cellar, mislabeled as a vintage port records, 1840. Margaret found it. It was a thin, unassuming ledger, bound in plain black leather. Inside, in Davias's neat, precise hand, was a meticulous record of every fraudulent transaction, every phantom company, every pound sterling siphoned from the Blackmore estate over a decade. It was a diary of a long and prosperous betrayal. She felt a cold thrill of victory. "I have him," she whispered to herself in the flickering lamplight. She took the ledger straight to the study. Alexander was there waiting. She placed it on the desk between them without a word. He opened it. As he read, his face became a mask of stone. The sheer scale of the deception, the cold-blooded treachery of a man he had considered a friend, was staggering. "We have him," he said, finally, his voice thick with anger. He looked up at her, and his eyes were filled with a profound gratitude that went far beyond the numbers. Margaret, you did it." In that moment, the air between them crackled with an unspoken truth. This was no longer about an employer and his analyst. This was about two people who had found in each other a trust and an intimacy that neither had expected. He reached across the desk and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, firm. It was not the gesture of a duke to a subordinate. It was the touch of a man reaching for an equal. Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and intense. Tomorrow, we end this." But they had underestimated the enemy. They had assumed they were the only ones hunting. They did not know that the Dowager, fueled by jealousy and suspicion, had been feeding her own observations to the one man she still trusted. Mr. Davies, the threat, when it came, did not arrive with a polite knock. It kicked the door in. The next morning, as Alexander was preparing to ride to the magistrate's office in the nearby town, a carriage arrived at Blackmore. It was not the magistrate, it was Mr. Davies, and he was not alone. He was accompanied by two stern-faced constables. The Dowager met them in the great hall, her expression, one of grim, theatrical sorrow. Alexander came down the main staircase to find them assembled, a tableau of impending disaster. "A Davies," he said, his voice cold. "To what do I owe this intrusion?" A grave matter, your grace," Davies said, his face a mask of false regret. "A matter of theft. Of fraud." He paused for effect. "I have come for Miss Ainsworth." Margaret had heard the commotion and had come out of the study, the hidden ledger clutched in her hands. She stopped at the edge of the hall, seeing the scene before her. The constables, the triumphant glint in the dowager's eyes, the solicitor's smug expression. It was a trap. What is the meaning of this?" Alexander demanded, moving to stand between Davies and the study doorway, instinctively shielding Margaret from view. "The meaning, your grace," Davies said, holding up a sheaf of papers, "is that, in the course of my own review of the estate's finances, I have uncovered a systematic fraud. Funds being diverted into a private account." He looked past Alexander to Margaret. An account linked to a woman with a certain family history in these matters. It seems the apple does not fall far from the tree. Like father, like daughter. Oh, the old lie. The one that had ruined her family, now brought out again, polished and weaponized. The dowager made a small, pained sound, a perfect performance of a woman shocked and betrayed. This is absurd," Alexander said, his voice tight with rage. Is it?" Davies countered smoothly. "I have sworn statements. Bank records. It is all here. She has been robbing you blind, your grace, preying on your grief. I am here to take her into custody." One of the constables took a step forward. Alexander did not move. He was a wall. "You will do no such thing," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I will not have you accuse her. She is under my protection." It was not a declaration of love. It was a declaration of allegiance, torn from him under pressure, a half-confession of where he stood, made not in the quiet of the study, but in the cold light of the great hall, with enemies arrayed against him. He was choosing. And he was choosing her. Margaret watched, her heart pounding. The ledger in her hands felt impossibly heavy. Davies had sprung his trap, using her past as the bait. He had twisted her discovery into a weapon against her. He was counting on Alexander's trust in him, on the dowager's influence, on the stain of her father's name. Your grace," Davies said, his tone shifting to one of pity. I understand your attachment, but you are being deceived. For the good of the estate, you must stand aside." He had another document ready. "In light of this, and your recent erratic behavior, your mother and I have been forced to petition the trustees to have the estate placed under more stable management. For your own protection, of course." It was a coup, a perfectly executed one. He was not just trying to remove her. He was trying to remove Alexander himself. The dowager stood by, her face impassive. She was willing to see her own son declared incompetent to rid herself of the woman she saw as a rival. The reckoning was not to be a quiet affair in a magistrate's office. It was to be here, now, in the heart of Blackmore. The trustees, Davies announced with a triumphant air, had been summoned. They were already on their way. The hearing would take place this afternoon. In the library at Blackmore was a cathedral of knowledge and power. 2 stories high, walled with books from floor to ceiling. It was the room where generations of dukes had made decisions that shaped the county. Today, it was to be a courtroom. 3 trustees arrived by midday gray, sober men who sat at the long library table looking deeply uncomfortable. Davies stood at one end, a mountain of documents before him. The dowager sat near the fire, a portrait of maternal concern. Alexander stood by the tall windows, his arms crossed, his face like thunder, and Margaret sat alone at a small side table, the black ledger before her. She was the accused. She felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their silence. She was calm. It was the strange, terrible calm that comes when you have nothing left to lose. Davies began. He laid out his case with practiced skill, weaving a tale of a cunning adventuress who had preyed upon a grieving duke. He presented bank statements showing deposits into an account he had secretly opened in her name. He spoke of her father's disgrace, painting a picture of inherited criminality. He was smooth, persuasive, and utterly convincing. The trustees listened, their faces growing grimmer by the minute. Then the dowager spoke. Her voice was soft, laced with sorrow. She spoke of her love for her son, her fear for the family's honor. She spoke of Margaret as a creeping influence, a woman of no background who had overstepped her station. A she must be made to know her place, she concluded, her voice trembling with false emotion, echoing the words that had started it all. It looked hopeless. The evidence was fabricated, but it was plausible. The narrative was powerful. The room was turning against them. Then Alexander spoke. This is a litany of lies," he said, his voice ringing with cold fury. And I will not stand for it. Your Grace," one of the trustees said gently. The evidence is compelling. Your judgment is in question." Alexander looked at Margaret. He was asking for a sign, a signal. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. The evidence is not what it seems," Alexander said. Miss Ainsworth will now address you." All eyes turned to her. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. But a poor gentlewoman with facts, that was another matter entirely. Margaret rose. She did not look at Davies or the dowager. She addressed the trustees. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and carried to every corner of the silent room. Gentlemen," she began, Mr. Davies has presented you with a story. I would like to present you with a set of numbers. I.e., she did not defend herself. She did not plead her innocence. She simply opened the black ledger. For the next hour, she spoke. With relentless, dispassionate clarity, she walked them through the truth. She used Davies's own secret account book as her text. She showed them the real fraud, the decade of slow, patient theft. She cross-referenced every entry in the secret ledger with the official estate accounts, showing where the numbers had been altered, where the lies had been inserted. She unwove his web, thread by thread, until the entire, ugly pattern was laid bare for them all to see. She was not an impassioned victim. She was a teacher, an expert delivering a lecture. Her command of the facts was absolute, her logic irrefutable. The room was spellbound. The trustees, who had been looking at her with suspicion, now leaned forward, their expressions shifting from doubt to dawning comprehension, and finally, to cold anger directed at the man at the end of the table. Davies began to bluster, to object, but his words were hollow. Margaret had taken his own weapon and dismantled him with it. He grew pale, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead. The dowager sat frozen in her chair, her face a mask of disbelief. She had thought she was swatting a fly, and had instead unleashed a lion. Margaret finished by closing the ledger. The soft thud of the book echoed in the silence. "Of the account Mr. Davies so kindly opened in my name," she said, her voice dropping, "was funded by a single deposit made 2 days ago. The funds were transferred from an account in London, which, as the ledger shows, is the same account into which he has been diverting estate funds for the last 10 years. He was not uncovering my fraud. He was framing me with his own stolen money." The silence that followed was devastating. It was the silence of a truth that could not be denied. One of the trustees, a stern-faced baron, turned his gaze on Davies. Is this true?" he demanded. Davies opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was broken. It was then that Alexander made his move. He walked from the window, not to the trustees, not to Davies, but to Margaret. He stopped beside her, turning to face the room. He was no longer the grieving recluse. He was the Duke of Blackmore, in full command of his house. And his authority, "A Miss Ainsworth," he said, his voice resonating with pride, has single-handedly saved this family from a ruin we were too blind to see." She has shown more loyalty, more intelligence, and more honor than anyone in this room. He glanced at his mother, his eyes filled with a cold, final disappointment. You spoke of her place, mother. You seem to have a great concern for it. Hey. He reached down and took Margaret's hand, lacing his fingers with hers. Her hand was trembling slightly, but he held it fast. Oh, let me be clear. So, there is no further confusion, he said, his voice ringing through the library. He looked from the shocked faces of the trustees to his mother as horrified one. Her place is here, by my side. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he delivered the final devastating blow, as the future Duchess of Blackmore. A collective gasp went through the room. The dowager looked as if she had been struck. Margaret's heart stopped. He was proposing, here, now, in front of everyone, a public declaration of belonging, so audacious, so absolute, that it shattered every lie, every insult, every carefully constructed humiliation. He turned to her then, his eyes searching hers, his grip on her hand tightening. If she will have me, he added, his voice suddenly softer. For her alone, the crime was that she had been chosen first. The vindication was in being chosen last, and for all the world to see. The constables, who had stood awkwardly by the door, now moved with purpose, but not toward Margaret. They moved toward the pale, sweating figure of Mr. Davies. The dowager sat, for the first time in her life, utterly silenced, reduced, not to ruin, but to irrelevance. A room that no longer believed her was a prison more complete than any tower. That night, the house was quiet. The trustees were gone. Davies was in a cell in the county jail. The dowager had retired to her rooms and locked the door. A fragile peace had settled over Blackmore. Margaret was in the study, staring into the fire. The room was the same, but her world had been irrevocably altered. She heard the door open and knew it was him. Alexander entered and came to stand beside her at the hearth. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the flames dance. Was it for show? She asked at last, her voice barely a whisper. The proposal. No, he said simply. Then it was gratitude, she stated, turning to face him. Her composure was back, a shield she had raised automatically. You do not have to marry me to thank me, Your Grace. A handsome bonus will suffice. We can call the debt paid. Do not call it gratitude, he said, his voice rough. He reached out and took her hands, pulling her gently away from the fire, turning her to face him. A gratitude is what I feel for my butler for his years of service. It is a fine and noble thing, but it is a cold emotion. What I feel for you is not cold. Margaret, he looked down at their joined hands. I was a coward, he confessed, the words costing him. I was drowning in grief, and it was easier to drown than to fight my way back to the surface. I let my house crumble, my duties slide. I was a ghost in my own life. He lifted his eyes to hers. They were clear, honest, and stripped of all artifice. You woke this house up. You woke me up. You walked into this cold, silent place, and you were not afraid of the dark. You simply lit a lamp and got to work. He took a breath. I started noticing you months ago. Your quiet strength, the way you handled my mother, the intelligence in your eyes. I was drawn to you, but I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. My mother's cruelty. It was a terrible thing, but it forced my hand. It gave me an excuse to finally speak to you, to bring you into my world. 20. She searched his face, wanting to believe him, but afraid. Hope was a more dangerous thing than any enemy. Do not say it, if it is only gratitude, she whispered again, a plea. It is not gratitude, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. It is a necessity. I find I am no longer willing to contemplate a future that does not have you in it. When I saw you standing there today, so calm and so brave, while they threw lies at you, I realized my own place. It is wherever you are. He lifted a hand and gently brushed the smudge of ink that was as always on her cheek. The proposal was not for show, and it was not gratitude. It was the truest thing I have said in years. I love you, Margaret Ainsworth. Will you be my wife? The shield around her heart did not just crack, it dissolved. The feelings she had packed down for a lifetime rose up, a warm, overwhelming tide. Tears filled her eyes, not tears of sorrow or humiliation, but of a joy so profound it was painful. She did not give him a grand speech. She gave him the simple truth. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Alexander. He closed the space between them and kissed her. It was not a practiced, elegant kiss. It was clumsy and honest and desperate. It was the kiss of two people who had been lost and had, against all odds, found their way home to each other. Spring came to Blackmore, and it was a revelation. The neglected gardens burst forth with daffodils and tulips. The northern sun, so long a stranger, seemed to pour its pale gold light into every window. The sound of laughter, a sound that had been absent for years, now echoed in the halls. Margaret, now the Duchess of Blackmore, stood in the study, but she was not alone. Alexander stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They were not looking at a ledger. They were looking at a large map of the estate, spread across the desk. New lines were being drawn, plans for new cottages, for repaired roofs, for a schoolhouse in the village. It was a map of the future. The portrait of Amelia, the late Duchess, still hung in the drawing room. Margaret had insisted on it. Her memory was honored, a gentle presence rather than a haunting one. The dead had been given their place, and in doing so, had freed the living. The Dowager Duchess now resided in the Dower House, a comfortable but remote exile. She was cared for, but her power was broken. She was a queen without a court. Alexander reached for the great leather-bound family Bible that sat on the corner of the desk. He opened it to the page that recorded the family line. There, at the bottom, in his own strong hand, was the newest entry. The ink was dark and permanent. Margaret Ainsworth, Duchess of Blackmore, her name, written not as an expense in a ledger, not as a disgrace in a court record, but here, at the heart of it all. A name that had been given its true and final place. He closed the book and looked at his wife, his love, the woman who had saved him. "A home," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound contentment. She leaned back against him, her heart full. She had been told to know her place, and she did. It was not a station to be kept, or a rank to be endured. It was this. It was him. It was the warmth of the sun on her face, the strength of his arms around her, the steady, certain knowledge that she was at long last home. She was the woman who had not just been chosen. She was the woman who had stayed.